arguments against moral relativism. And there are more arguments that I'm going to give here, but here are a few of the main points against it. So, one of the main arguments for moral relativism is the idea of moral diversity, and that's the idea that we as we saw before, that, well, a lot of people disagree about what's right and wrong, so therefore there must be no fact of the matter about it. There's a lot of reasons why this is a bad argument, but one of the reasons is that, as the philosopher James Rachels and other people have pointed out, some of the disagreements between cultures on moral issues just are misunderstandings of that culture. And he points to a lot of the classic examples people give, like infanticide and things like, he also talks about the practice of not eating beef in Hindu countries, and it's he says that, look, it's not as though we really disagree on the fundamental sort of principles of morality. It's rather that they sort of come out in different ways for various reasons. So, for example, infanticide is really not a common practice, and it's usually only resorted to as a last resort. And so it's not as though those cultures don't value human life. It's just that if they find themselves in really terrible circumstances, they have to make these hard decisions. And as far as the not eating beef, he says, look, you got to think about that. It's seen in that culture as a form of cannibalism in a way because of the idea of reincarnation, that you could be reincarnated into that animal. And so it's not as though there's a really fundamental difference. It's just that the differences are more on the surface level, or even misunderstandings. So he says, look, an underlying concept of the human good and all the different sets of beliefs that people have in different cultures is evidence that there could be a fact of the matter about what's good for humans, and there could be a sort of, that could perhaps be used to judge morality in a way that cultural relativists don't want to admit. So this reductio ad absurdum means like reducing to absurdity. So this argument against cultural relativism says, look, if cultural relativism is true, it means that any culture, what they say is good within that culture. So you would have to, as a moral relativist, then say that it was okay to do all sorts of things that we might not want to admit are okay to do. So, for example, if one culture decides that it's okay to kill innocent children, then moral relativism has to say that that's okay. But it's clearly absurd to allow the killing of innocent children, so therefore moral relativism must be false, so the argument goes. So the idea is that if it leads to an absurd conclusion, then that premise must be false. So the idea is that, look, it's pretty ridiculous to think that we should endorse just anything, even if just because a particular culture endorses it. So that's a reduction to absurdity against moral relativism. Equally difficult is the idea of moral progress. If you can't admit that a culture could ever be wrong about what they endorse as far as morality, then you can never say that a culture could be improved. So there would have been no reason for us to get rid of Jim Crow laws or do any of the improvements that we've made to our culture, because if the culture endorses it, it's right. Therefore, there's no outside principle. There's no way that you can say that Jim Crow laws are wrong outside of the culture. There's no principle that you can sort of appeal to. There's no principle to appeal to outside of the culture in order to say this law is wrong. So you can only say, well, this culture says it's right, or this culture says it's right, but you can't make a blanket statement about right and wrong, so there's no way to have moral progress. This, I think, is a big problem with relativism, perhaps even more than some of the other problems. The idea is that we want to be able to say that we could be doing it wrong, and we can't with moral relativism. So that's just a really short kind of rundown of the basic arguments against moral relativism. So next we'll move on and talk about some other views.